our God. Indeed, He is great. We have so many things to thank God for. And as you look back this year, I'm sure many of us have taken stock of what has happened in our lives, our experiences, and God has always been there. We don't know what lies ahead of us in the following year, but I'm sure God will always be with us.
Like your Christmas season? So Christmas season is full of two things: adoration and adornment. Is that right? I mean, all around town, houses are getting adorned with Christmas lights. Outside, the trees are getting adorned with, and inside, decorations. But what is Christmas all about to you? Is it all about adornment, or is it all about adoration? Now, Christ came for a purpose, and that purpose was all about to give life. And yet, all the adornment seems to be looking at, look at my house, look at what I've done. And when we adorn our trees, what is that all about? And I'm not saying trees are bad, I'm not saying decorating trees is bad, but what's the purpose? What's the point of all of that, is my question. Now, all through Scripture, you don't see an awful lot about adornment or adoration, the words, but you do see an awful lot about worship. And that's what adoration is all about. I'm going to spend most of the time this morning reading a story because it illustrates it so much better. Many of you are familiar with the Christmas in My Heart books. How many have all 26 of them? I've got all 26. I love these things. There's more than 400 stories, and I've read them all, except for the last book I'm not quite finished yet. But what's the point of all of these stories? Cute stories? No. There's about the spirit of Christmas. About not wanting things for yourself, but doing something for somebody else. Seeing that Christ is the point. We need to worship Him. Now, this person who's compiled all these stories, Joe Wheeler, he's a former English teacher, and he started off with the first book, saying it'd be a wonderful idea because he just loves Christmas stories, and he found so many of them. There's thousands of Christmas stories out there. He found so many of them. He said, "Well, we ought to do another one." And he had so many, he says, well, let's do a third one and a fourth one, and he's still doing. He says, we're not slowing down. He's getting older, but it's been 26 years now since he first started that. I was managing an ABC back then, 26 years ago, and sold an awful lot of the first few, and that got me hooked as well, since I love these things. Well, this story is called Star Across the Tracks by Bess Streeter Aldrich. Now this story was set many years ago, and so you'll see that the language, the value of things, including what's important in life, is going to be a little different than what we have today. But the story is very, very clear. Mr. Harm Kurtz sat in the kitchen with his feet in the oven. You ever done that? Very common thing back in the day when you had ovens that were coal-fired or wood-fired. You stick your feet in the oven to warm them up. Because the oven was always there, because that was also heating the house. He stuck his feet in the oven, discussed the world, that is to say, his own small world. His audience, shifting back and forth between the pantry and the kitchen sink, caused the orator's voice to rise and fall with its coming and going. The audience was Mama. She was the bell upon which the clapper of his verbal output always struck, as she never stopped moving about at her housework during those nightly discourses. One might have said facetiously that she was his roaming form. Pa Kurtz was slight and wiry, all muscle and bounce. His life was, and here's a French word, and I looked it up and had it repeated 10 or 20 times, but I still can't pronounce it. It means heavy. She was heavy and had some to spare, and her leisurely walk was known in common parlance as a waddle. She wore her hair combed high, brushed tightly up at the back and sides where it ended in a hard knot at the top of her head. When movie stars and the Cafe Society took it up, Mama said she had beat them to it by 35 years. The Kurtzes lived in a small brown house on Mill Creek, which meandered its unpaved way along a creek bed, the town having been laid out by the founding fathers on the once flowing but now long-dried creek was called River City. For 3 days of his working week, Pa's narrow world held sundry tasks: plowing gardens, cutting alfalfa, hauling lumber from the mill. For the other 3 days, he was engaged permanently as a handyman by the families of Scott, Dillingham, and Porter, who lived on Highview Drive, far away from Mill Street, geographically, economically, socially. What Mama hadn't learned about Scott, Dillingham, and Porter domestic establishments in the last few years wasn't worth knowing anyway. Early in the labors for the 3 families, Pa had summed them up to Ma in one sweeping statement: the Scotts, him I like, her I don't like. The Dillinghams, her I like, him I don't. The Porters, I don't like. The Porters' house was brick colonial. The Scotts was a rambling stone of ranch type. The Dillinghams had no classification, but was both brick and stone, stained shingles, lumber, tile, glass, bricks, and stucco. The Porter had 4 children of school age. Also, they had long, curving rows of evergreens in which the grackles settled with raucous glee as though to outvie the family's noise. The grackles, and for all Paul knew, maybe the young folks also, drove Mrs. Porter wild, but Pa rather liked the birds. They sounded so country-like, and he had never grown away from the farm. Mr. Porter was a lawyer and a councilman. Mrs. Porter was a member of the garden club and knew practically all there was to know about flora and fauna. She went in for that formal bed of flowers, rectangles, half-moons, containing tulips and daffodils in spring, dahlias and asters later. She ruled Pa with iron efficiency. With a wave of her hand, she might say, "Mr. Kurtz, I think I'll have the flower beds further apart this year." And Pa, telling Mama about it at night, would sneer, "Just like they were springs and mattress kind of beds that you can shove around on casters." Mrs. Scott went to the other extreme. She knew the least about vegetation of anyone who had ever come under Pa's scrutiny. Assuredly, he was his own boss there. Every spring she tossed him several dozen packages of seeds as though she dared him to do his worst. Once he had found rutabaga and spinach among the packages of zinnias and nasturtiums, but Pa couldn't be too hard on her, for she had a little crippled son who took most of her time. And he liked the fresh-colored packages every year and the feel of the warm, moist earth he had put when he put in the seeds. The head of the house was a doctor, and if he happened to drive up when Pa was there, he stopped and joked a bit. The Dillingham's yard was Pa's favorite. The back of it was not only informal, it was woodsy. Mrs. Dillingham told Pa that she had been raised on a farm and that the end of the yard reminded her of the grove back at her old home. She had no children, and often she came out to stand around talking to Pa, or brought her gloves and worked with him. "Poor thing, lonesome," Ma said at once when he was telling her. Mrs. Dillingham had Pa set out wild crabapple and ferns and plum trees, little crooked trees, so that it would look natural. Several times she had driven him out to the country, and they brought back shooting stars and swamp candle, Dutchman's breeches and wood violets. Pa's hand with the little wildflowers was as tender as the hand of God. When Mr. Dillingham came home from his big department store, he was loud and loquacious, sometimes critical of what had been done. In winter, the work for the Highview homes was just as hard and far less interesting. Storm windows, snow on the long driveways, basements to be cleaned. It was always good to get home and sit with his tired, wet feet in the oven and tell the day's experiences to Mama. There was something very comforting about Mama, her consoling, "Oh, think nothing of it," or her sympathetic clucking of tisk, tisk. Them women with their cars and their clubs. Tonight there was more than usual to tell, for there is great goings-on up on Highview. Tomorrow night was Christmas Eve, and in preparation for the annual prizes given by the Federated Civic Clubs, his 3 families had gone in for elaborate outdoor decorations. They were unspoken rivalry between the three houses, too. Pa can sense it. Mrs. Porter had asked him offhandedly, as though it were a matter of extreme unconcern, what the two other families were planning to do, and Mr. Dillingham had asked the same thing, but bluntly. But you couldn't catch Pa that way, though. He reminded Mama with great glee, slippery as an eel. He had just answered what the others seemed to be, hitching up a lot of wiring. But Pa had known all along what each one was doing, and tomorrow night everybody would know. The Porters had long strings of blue lights, which they were carrying out into the evergreens as though bluebirds instead of black ones were sitting there to stay through Christmas. The Dillinghams had gone in for reindeer. They had ordered them made from plyboard at the mill, and tonight the 8 deer and the artificial snow all over them were prancing up the porch steps, while a searchlight on the ground threw the group into relief. The Scotts, whose house was not so high as the others, had a fat Santa on the roof with one foot in the chimney. In a nearby dormer window there was a phonograph that could play Jingle Bells. So what the song seemed to be coming from the old fella himself. It had made the little crippled boy laugh and clap his hands when they wheeled him outside to see the pennies sing. All this and much more Pa was telling Mama while she ambled about getting supper on the table. Lily came home. Lily was the youngest of their 3 children, and she worked for the Dillinghams too, but in the department store. Lily was a whiz with a needle and humble helper in the remodeling room. She made her own dresses at home and tried them on Maisie, the mannequin. That was one of the store's moronic-looking models, which had lost an arm and sundry other features, and Lily had asked for it when they found that they were going to discard it. Ernie, her brother, had brought it home in his car and repaired it. And now she hung her own skirts on Maisie to get their length. And that was about all it was good for, because Lily's circumference was fully 3 times that of the model. The 3 of them sat down to eat, so Ernie would not arrive. As Ernie would not arrive for a long time, and Mama would warm things over for him. As usual, the table talk came largely from Pa. He had to tell it all over to Lily. The blue lights, the reindeer, the Santa with one foot in the chimney. Lily, who was a bit fed up with the pasteboard reindeer and synthetic Santas at the store, thought that she would still like to see them. So Pa said tomorrow night, after Carrie got there, they would all drive to Highview, that he himself would like to see them once the paved street, from the paved street, instead of his head caught in the evergreen branch or getting a crick in his neck under the reindeer's belly. They discussed the coming of the older daughter and her husband Bert, and the 2 little boys who were driving here from their home in another county and planning to stay 2 whole nights. A large event, Christmas was, that year in Mill Street, Kurt's home. After supper, when Lily started the dishes, Pa went out to see to the team, and Mama followed to pick out 2 of the fat hens for Christmas dinner. In the dusk of the unusually mild December evening, Mama stood looking about her as with the eye of a stranger. Then she said she wished things had been in better shape before Carrie and Bert got there, that not one thing had been done around the place to fix it up since that last time. That rickety old shed, Pa, she said mildly. I remember as well as I'm standing here, you telling Carrie we're going to have it good new lumber on it by the next time she came. It was as a match to pine shavings. It made Pa good and mad. With him working his head off day and night, he blew up. In anyone under 12, it would have been called a tantrum. He rushed over to the tool house, he got his hammer, and he started to yank off the rotten boards. I'll get this done before Carrie comes, he says, if it's the last thing I do. A psychoanalyst, after much probing, might have discovered what caused Pa's sudden anger. But Mama, who knew less than nothing about psychoanalysis, having only good common sense, already knew what caused it. Pa's own regrets over his big mistake made him irritable at times, and he was one of those farmers who had turned their backs on an old home place during the protracted drought. Mama had wanted to stick it out another year, but he had said no, they were going to move to town and be like everybody else and earn good money. So they had sold the farm, bought this little place on Mill Street. That's the only section of town where they could keep a cow and chickens. The very next year, crops were good again. And now the man who bought the old place for so little came to River City in a car as fine as the Dillingham. Yes, any casual criticism of the Mill Street place always touched him in a vital spot of his being. So he yanked and he swore and he jawed more than ever. Then Ma had to walk away. It was not hard to get the old boards off. Soon they lay on the ground and in a scattered heap of rotting timbers. Bird and Bell, from their exposed position from the manger, snatched the alfalfa hay, quivered their nostrils, and looked disdainfully at the proceedings. The cow chewed her cud in the loose-jawed way of cows and stared disinterestedly into space. Looking at the animals on which he was so fond, Pa admitted to himself that he needn't have ripped the boards off until morning. But balmy weather was predicted all through Christmas, and Ma had made him pretty mad. Suddenly the fire of his anger went out, for he was remembering something that Ernie had said, and it tickled his fancy. The last time Carrie brought her little boys home, Ernie had told them it was bubble gum the cows were chewing. And the kids hung over that half door an hour or more waiting for the big bubble to blow out. Tomorrow night the little kids would be here again, and he thought just righted the whole world. Mama came toward him with two hens under her arms as though she wanted him to make up with her. But he fussed around among the boards, not wanting to seem so pleasant too suddenly. His flashlight lay on the ground, highlighting the open shed, and the street light too shone in, and the old hen flew squawking out of the hay, and the pigeons swooped down on the roof. Ma looked at it for quite a while, then all at once she chucked the hens under a box and hurried into the house. When she came out, she held Maisie, the mannequin, in front of her, and Lily was close behind with an armful of sheets. "What do you think you're up to?" Paul asked. "You let me be," Mama said pointedly. "I know what I'm doing." She set up the mannequin with the deft touches. Lily draped sheets over the body, head, and arranged it so it was leaning over the manger. Then Mama put Pa's flashlight down in the manger itself, and a faint light shone through the cracks of the old boards. "There," said Mama, stepping back. "Don't that look for all the world like the Bible story?" Sure seems like it's making light of it," Pa said critically. "The Scotts and the Dillinghams didn't do nothing like that. They used Santa Clauses." "I ain't doing it for show like them," Mama reported. "I'm doing it for Carrie's little boys. Something they can see for themselves when they drive in. Something they'll never forget, like as not, long as they live." Mama and Lily went out to the fence to survey their handiwork from that point. They were standing there when Ernie drove into the yard. Ernie worked for the River City Body and Fender Wreck Company, and one viewing the car and hearing its noisy approach would have questioned whether he ever patronized his own business. They were anxious to know what Ernie thought. There were the horses nuzzling the alfalfa, the cow chewing away placidly, the pigeons on the ridgepole, and there was the white-robed figure bending over the faint glow in the manger. Ernie stood without words. Then he said, "What in time?" The words were crude, but the tone was reverent. "Mama did it for the kids," Lily said. "She wants you to fix a star over the stable. Mrs. Dillingham gave an old one to Pa." Ernie had been a fixer ever since he was a little boy. Not for his looks had River City Body and Fender Wreck Company hired Ernie Kurtz. So after his warmed-over supper, he got his tools and a coil of wire, fixed the yellow bauble high over the stable, and the wire and the slim rod looked almost invisible, so that it seemed like a star hung there all by itself. All the next day, Paul worked up on High View Drive, and all day Mama cleaned the house, made donuts and cookies with green sugar on them, and dressed the fat hens, stuffing them to the bursting point with onion dressing. Almost before she knew it, Christmas Eve had arrived. Carrie and Bert and the two little boys were driving into the yard with everyone hurrying out to greet them. "Why, Mama," Carrie said, "that old shed, it just gave me a turn when we drove in." But Mama was a bit disappointed over the little boys. The older one comprehended what it meant and was duly awestruck. But the younger one ran over to the manger and said, "When is he going to blow out the bubble?" After they had taken in the wrapped presents and the mince pies Carrie had baked, Pa told them how they were all going up to Highview and see the expensive decorations, stressing his own part in their preparation so much that Mama said, "Don't brag." A few others had something to do with it, you know, and Ernie went with them into laughter, as he called it, highbrow drive. Then he went after his girl, Annie Hansen, and they came back. Surprisingly, her brother was with them, which sent Lily into a state of fluttering excitement. So they all started out in 2 cars, Ernie and his girl and Lily in Ernie's 1-seat car, with the brother in the back with his long legs dangling out. Carrie and Bert took their little boys and Mama and Pa. Not knowing the streets leading to the winding Highview section, Bert stayed close behind Ernie's car, which chugged its way ahead of them like a noisy tugboat. Everyone was hilariously happy. As for Pa, his anger about Mama's chidings was long forgotten. All 3 of his children were home and the 2 little kids. The Dillinghams didn't have any children at all for Christmas fun. "We never lost a child," he was thinking. "And the Porters have lost the little girl. Our grandkids, tough as tripe, and the Scotts have got that crippled boy." It gave him light-hearted feeling of freedom from disaster. Now the nice sightseeing trip in Bert's good car. Home to coffee and donuts, and the kids hanging up their stockings. Tomorrow the presents and a big dinner. For fleeting moments, Pa Kurtz had a warm little boy feeling of his own toward Christmas. Mama too, and she hadn't had such a good time since Tig was a pup. And when one of the little boys said he wanted to see Tig when he got back, everyone laughed immoderately. They passed decorated houses and countless trees, brightly lighted in the windows, then around the curving streets in the Highview district, following Ernie's noisy lead so closely that Carrie said they were just like Mary's little lamb. Across the street from the Porter's colonial house, Ernie stopped, and they stopped too. The evergreens with their sparkling blue lights seemed a part of an enchanted forest. Carrie said she had never seen anything so pretty in her life and waxed so enthusiastic that Pa reminded her again of his big part in it. When Ernie yelled back to ask if they had seen enough, Paul waved them on, and around the curve they went to the Dillinghams. There were other cars in front of the houses. Pa said, like as not, the judges themselves were right now deciding the prizes. And by the tone of his voice, one would have thought the fate of the nation hung in the decision. At the Dillinghams, one of the little boys waxed more excited over the reindeer, lighted by the searchlight which threw them in a snow-white relief. Yes, Pa said, it was worth all the work they had put on them. Then to Dr. Scott's, and here the little boys practically turned inside out. For Santa himself was up on the roof as plain as day, and more. He was singing Jingle Bells, Jingle Bells. When he stopped, they clapped their hands and yelled up at him, "Hey, Santa, sing more!" And the adults all clapped too. Then Ernie signaled, and the little procession swung down out of Highview and circled into the part of town where the blocks were prosaically rectangular and everything became smaller. Yards, houses, and Christmas trees. "Look," Mama said happily, "ain't it nice? There ain't no patent on it. Everyone can make merry. Every little house can have its own fun and tree, just the same as the big ones." Over the railroad tracks they went in to Mill Street, where Ernie picked his way around the mushy spots in the unpaved road, with Bert following his zigzag lead, and the trip was over. There were Bird and Bell and the cow, and there were the pigeons huddled on the stable roof, and there was the white Mary and the light in the manger and the star. The laughter died down. Everyone got quiet. Carrie ran her arm through her mother's. "I like yours too, Mama," she said. Inside, they grew merry again. Over the donuts and the sandwiches, there was a lot of talk. They argued noisily about the prizes, prize places for the decorated house, betting one another which one would win. Carrie and Lily both thought the lights on the trees were by far the most artistic. Ma and Ernie's girl, they were for the reindeer at the Dillinghams. But Lily's potential beau, Ernie and Bert, and the little boys were all for the Scots Santa Claus. Pa, as one who had been the creator of them all, stayed benignly neutral. After a while, Ernie took his girl home. Her brother stood around on the porch a while with Lily and then left. Little boys hung up their stockings, and with the grown folks teasing them, saying Santa would never find his way around the Scots down that winding streets of mud. Mama and Pa kept their own bedroom. Lily took Carrie in with her. Bert made little boys a bed on the old couch with 3 chairs in front to keep them from falling out. They had no sheets left for them, but plenty of clean patchwork quilts. In the morning there was sketchy breakfast and the presents, including a dishpan for Mama, who had never had a new one since her wedding day. Bit and braces for Pa, he had wished for so long, a flowered comb and brush set for Lily, and fully 1/3 of the things for which the little boys had wished. The children would play with their new toys, and the men would pitch horseshoes. Mama and the girls had to hop right into the big dinner for everyone, for everyone would be starved with the scanty breakfast. Ernie's girl and her brother were invited too, and when they came, they could smell the good dressing clear out in the yard. The hens practically popped open in the pans, and Mama's mashed potatoes and gravy melted in the mouth. Oh, never did anyone have a nicer Christmas than the Kurtzes down on Mill Street. It was when they were finishing Carrie's thick mince pies that the radio news came on and the announcement of the prizes. So they pulled back their chairs to listen, and the girls cautioned the men folks. Now stick to what you bet on last night, and don't anybody cheat by changing. The announcer introduced the committee head, who gave a much too wordy talk with civic pride, and then the prizes. The third prize of $10 to Dr. Amos R. Scott, 1821 Highview Drive. This was the Santa in the chimney. And while Ernie and the group groaned their disappointment that it was only third, the others laughed at them for their poor bet. The second, $25, Mr. Ramsey E. Porter, 1484 Highview Drive, the Blue Lights, with Carrie and Lily wanting to know what the judges were thinking of, for Pete's sake, to give it only a second prize, and Mama and Ernie's girl calling out jubilantly that it was left only for their choice, the reindeer. Then a strange thing happened. Listen, everybody. Shh. What's he saying? The first prize, for its simplicity, for using materials at hand without expense, for its sacred note and the fact that it is the personification of the real Christmas story, of which we sometimes lose sight. The first prize of $50 is unanimously awarded to Mr. Harm Kurtz at 623 Mill Street. A bomb would have torn fissures in the road and made an unamendable shambles of the house, but it could not have been any more devastating. For a long moment they sat stunned, mouths open, but without speech coming forth, and only the little boy saying, "He said you, Grandpa. He said you." Then the hypnotic spell broke, and Ernie let out a yell, $50, Pa, $50. And Mama, still dazed, kept repeating like a mournful raven, "But I just did it for the little boys." Several got up and dashed over to the window to see again this first prize bargain. But all they could see was Bird and Belle and the cow out in their little yard and the dilapidated old shed, and high up over it a piece of yellowed glass. In the midst of the excitement, Pa was practically turned pale, for it had come to him suddenly that there was more to this than meet the eye. What would the Scots, the Porters, and the Dillinghams say, especially Mr. Dillingham, whose expensive reindeer had won no prize at all? He was embarrassed and worried. The joy had gone out of winning the prize. The joy had gone out of the day. The girls had scarcely finished dishes before the Mill Street neighbors started coming in to have a share in the big news. The Danish Hansons came, and the Russian family from the next block, all 3 of the Czech families down the street, and the Negro children who lived near the mill. They were all alike to Mama, just folks, she said. She gave everyone a donut. In fact, they ate so many that late in the afternoon she had to whip up another batch. Also, out in honor of the great occasion, she combed her hair again and that high, skinned-up way and put on a second clean apron. 2 clean aprons in one day constituted the height of something or other. Somebody might come by, she said, by the way of apology. They'll get stuck in the mud if they do, said Ernie. I'm the only one who knows the holes like a map. Mama was right. Somebody came by. All of River City came by. Soon after dusk, with the star lighted and Bird and Bell back in the shed, the cars began to drive past in an unending parade. Traffic was as thick as it had ever been up on Main in Washington. You could hear talk and laughter and maybe strong words about the mud holes. Then, in front of the yard, both talk and laughter would die down. There would be only low-spoken words or silence. Bird and Bell pulling at the hay, the cow gazing moodily into space, the pigeons on the ridgepole in long feathery group, White Mary bending over the faint glow in the manger, and overhead the star. In silence the cars would drive by and more would take their places. 3 of them did not drive away. They swung in closer to the fence and all the people got out and came into the yard. Of all things! Mama, there come the Scotts and the Porters and the Dillinghams. Pa was too excited for words and hardly knew what he was doing. But Mama was cool and she went out to meet them. Shh, they're just folks. The Scotts were lifting the wheelchair out of the car for which it had been custom built for it. Dr. Scott wheeled the little boy up closer so he could see the animals. Carrie's little boys ran to them and tactlessly, of little children, showed them that how they could turn cartwheels all around the chair. Why, Mr. Kurtz, Mrs. Porter was saying, you're the sly one, helping us all the time and then getting the grand prize yourself. Pa let it go. They would just have to believe it was all of his doings, but for a fleeting moment he saw himself yanking madly at the shed boards. Mrs. I don't like Scott said, it's the sweetest thing I ever saw. It made me feel like crying when I saw it. Mrs. Dillingham said it made all of their decorations look cheap and shoddy by the side of that major scene. Even Mr. Dillingham, who had won no prize, said, Kurtz, you certainly deserve it. Pa knew he couldn't take any more praise, at least not with Mama standing right there. So he said, I guess it was all Mama's idea. She's always getting ideas. Right then, Ma had another idea. Will you all please step inside and have a cup of coffee and a donut? The women demurred, but all the men said they certainly would. So they crowded into the kitchen. Mink coats and all stood around with coffee and donuts, and Lily got up her courage and said to Mr. Dillingham, I don't suppose you know me, but I work for you. Oh, yes, sure I do, he said heartily, but Lily knew he was only being polite. And this is a friend of mine, she added with a cry of bravado, Mr. Hanson. Mr. Dillingham, how do you do, Mr. Hanson? Don't tell me you work for me too. Yes, sir, I do, said Lily's new beau, packing. And Highview and Mill Street both laughed over it. Mrs. Scott said, did you ever taste anything so good as these donuts? You couldn't find time to make me a batch once a week, could you? So that Mrs. Dillingham and Mrs. Porter both said quickly, not unless she makes one for me too. And Mama, pleased as punch, but paying hard to catch, said maybe she could. Mr. Porter was saying to Ernie, you folks ought to get some gravel down here on Mill Street. And Ernie, who wasn't afraid of anyone, not even a councilman, said with infinite sarcasm, you're telling me. The big cars all drove away. 3 or 4 others straggled in, then no more, and Pa turned off the light of the star. The house was still again, except for the breathing of one of the little boys. Even Ernie, coming in late, stopped tromping about upstairs. Everyone had to get up early to see Bert and Carrie off and get back to work. It made Pa worry about his inability to sleep. This had been the most exciting day in years. Mama was lying quietly, her heavy body sagging down her side of the bed. It took all of Pa's self-control to pretend sleep. Twice he heard the old kitchen clock strike another hour. He would try it. "Mama," he said softly. "What?" she said instantly. "Can't get to sleep." "What's the matter?" "Keep thinking about everything. All that money coming to us, company, attention from so many folks, children all home, folks I work for all here and not a bit mad. You'd think I'd feel good, but I don't. Something hangs over me like there'd been something real out there in the shed all this time, like we'd been leaving them out when we ought to have them come on in. Fool notion, but it keeps bothering me." And then Mama gave her answer, comforting too, just as he knew it would be. "I got the same feeling. I guess people like that, ever since it happened, their conscience always hurting them a little because there wasn't no room for him in the end." Christmas time, adoration, or adornment? What are you going to do with your Christmas? What are you going to do with your life? Adorn yourself? Adorn your house? Adorn your trees so that people can sing your praises? Or is it adoration to God? Let's sing that Christmas hymn, 132. "O come, all ye faithful. O come and adore him."